So now that we've talked about what format, model, type, and depth our data have, I'm going to suggest that we talk about what kind of attribute. And an attribute is kind of a way of describing any individual piece of the data set, kind of whether it's a field or a record. We'll talk more about that, but I want to start by just, this is kind of Data Science 101. There's kind of qualitative data and quantitative data. And I'm going to take kind of a different approach to this, maybe. A lot of these terms get difficult to understand as well, but I'd like to look at them more as subjective and objective. Quantitative being what we can measure as objectively as possible, and qualitative being we can try to be objective, but it usually takes a human to kind of establish a qualitative category or something like that. So qualitative, we'll use the words nominal and ordinal. Nominal means kind of just name, what are the categories, whether it's a road name or a land cover type. Even though we might be able to measure where the forest is or where the forest isn't or where there's water or that kind of thing, it still takes a human to call it a forest and kind of subject meaning onto it. So for our purposes, qualitative data will be described as nominal, meaning a name, or ordinal, meaning it has an order. So this might be a category of road or something that says, okay, A for this section of road means no shoulder if you're trying to bike it or something, and B might mean high traffic, and C might mean both, and if we added D, it might mean neither. There's an inherent order that is kind of subjective about that specific piece of road. We can do quantitative things with it, but I'd like to call ordinal qualitative for our purposes. The other part of ordinal data would be whether it's suitability or kind of endangered. It's how good is a piece of data on a scale. We say, oh yes, 0 being the worst, 10 being the best, or this is the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, right? Road hierarchy. That would be, this is a highway, this is a state road, this is a town road, this is a county road. Those are kind of ordinal classes that we subject onto the road. They don't exist without us deciding they exist. So kind of overly conceptual, but if we talk about nominal data or ordinal data, let's consider them kind of qualitative. Quantitative, this is maybe a little easier to understand. This is going to matter a lot when we get into thematic mapping. We have count, which is kind of like a raw number of things, whether it's number of people or number of miles or something like that. We have ratio, which is usually a percent, or it has the word per, like people per square mile, miles per hour, that kind of thing. And then we have interval, which means it's on a scale that is usually a human scale. So let me show you some examples of that. Count, yeah, road, right? Let's say the road that we're looking at has a name, it's nominal, Carl Bailey Road, has ordinal data, maybe about biking, but the count might be, oh, what are the number of miles? And that can be a real number, as you can see, could 0.678. Maybe this is probably too many decimal points to be meaningful, but that's okay. Ratio might be, okay, well, how many miles per hour are you allowed to move on that road? And that's ratio data. Interval might mean, okay, well, what is the gradient in percent or degrees? And you might say, well, percent, shouldn't that be a ratio? Well, the trick is that usually the ratio has kind of a natural 0. So, for instance, what percent of the population in any county might be over 60? We could say, well, 28%, but 0 is just 0, whereas in an interval setting, we might have negative numbers, right? How many feet above sea level? Oh, well, 0. Well, does that mean 0 like there's nothing there? No, it means 0 you are at sea level, because you could be below sea level. You could say, I'm 10 feet below, and that would be negative 10. So the difference is that 0 can sometimes be a part of a scale, and where 0 is on that scale might be kind of arbitrary. For instance, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, let me take that back, 0 degrees Celsius is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's an example of kind of a 0 that's somewhat arbitrary. It's a scale that has been created. Okay, so it's confusing to see this kind of diagram, but it might help when we start to look at data, kind of examples of it. So try to keep this in mind. The big two things to remember are quality and quantity. We use qualitative data and quantitative. These tend to be categories of some type, and these tend to be, quantities, numbers of things. So I'm going to show you one example really quick. And this is a map that I made for just kind of trying to show some topography. And you might say, well, all I see is elevation, and that is mostly true. So the bathymetry here, right? I'm going to zoom in. The bathymetry, which is just recorded for each pixel, which is an okay way to do it, not great. These are part of, we would call them quantitative data. They're quantitative. They came from a raster originally, a raster data set. They're quantitative, and I would call them interval because the 0, you'll see there's kind of a 0 at the low tide mark. There's also a 0 at the high tide mark. And so the other piece of data that is an interval would be these kind of vector contour lines. And the vector contour lines represent the topography, topography being kind of the shape of, the vertical shape of the Earth from quote-unquote 0. In this case, we're seeing a low tide 0 and a high tide 0. So in that case, we might even call that ordinal. There are, in the contour scheme of things, the order of the contours are light blue contours mean below sea level, kind of black or gray contours mean above sea level, and there's a darker contour which represents every 5 feet above and below, kind of the red one, which is the high tide line, and then the edge here is the low tide line. So it's not perfect, but you can kind of see, okay, we've got interval information, we've got ordinal information. What about count? We don't see that here, but if I was to report the number of acres, let's say the number of acres above the high tide line, that would be count, because we could say, oh, there are, whatever, 4.5 acres. That's a count piece of information. Ratio, if we wanted to say what percent of the land that is above the high tide line is grass, say 85% of the land cover is grass above the high tide line. Well, that would be a ratio. Now for nominal. Now this is more kind of to twist your brain again. You might say, well, there are lots of names. There's the ocean and the land and the contours. Well, we've decided the contours kind of more represent ordinal and interval information. The light green you see here and the light yellow and kind of this tint of the lower, kind of below high tide line elevations. These are kind of names. I didn't make a legend for it, but I'm hoping you can interpret this as more of a beach, and this is more of grass, and then this is a building actually. So the building footprint represents a category. This is a building. This is this is grass. This is kind of sandy beach or exposed beach, you might say. And then this is the tidal region. So even though there's no legend here telling us that, there is nominal data that we kind of interpret through just color telling us what it is. And yeah, exactly. And then kind of the labels would be the last thing I would say is nominal. So they all tend to blur together, but as we go along, it's helpful to know what you're representing and trying to use those words just so we're all on the same page. I'll use other examples in going forward with the videos. So, good luck with the tutorials, and email me if you've got any questions. Thanks.